December 4th, 1956, Sun Studio, Memphis, Tennessee. The session was over, the musicians were packing up, and the engineer was shutting down equipment when something extraordinary happened. Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash, along with Jerry Lee Lewis and Carl Perkins, thought the microphones were off. They thought the tape machines had stopped rolling. They thought nobody was listening. So they did something they never did in public, something that would have destroyed their carefully constructed bad boy images. They started singing gospel hymns. Not for radio, not for record sales, not for screaming fans, but for God. What happened in the next 90 minutes would accidentally create one of the most sacred recordings in American music history, capturing these legends in a moment of pure, unguarded worship that was never meant for public consumption. And when the tape was finally discovered decades later, it would reveal a truth about faith, fame, and authenticity that Hollywood had spent years trying to hide. Before we step into that studio and witness what nobody was supposed to hear, tell me, what city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, because this story about faith behind the facade is universal, touching something deeper than music or fame. Here's the question that'll wreck you. If you could be your truest self only when nobody was watching, what does that say about the life you're living in public? Elvis and Johnny faced that question every day, hiding their deepest beliefs behind images that sold records but starved their souls. If this story shakes you the way it should, hit that subscribe button. We're about to witness the most honest moment in rock and roll history, the moment when the king and the man in black forgot about their crowns and just became believers. To understand what happened that December night, you need to understand what Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash were carrying in 1956. Not just fame, but the crushing weight of images that contradicted their deepest identities. Elvis was selling sex to teenagers, gyrating his hips and driving parents to moral panic, while privately reading his Bible every night and praying on his knees like his mama had taught him. Johnny was building a reputation as an outlaw and rebel, dressed in black and singing about shooting men in Reno, while desperately missing the gospel songs he'd grown up singing in Arkansas church pews. Both men were Pentecostal at their core, raised in traditions where music and worship were inseparable, where Saturday night and Sunday morning existed in constant tension. But in 1956 America, you couldn't be Elvis the gospel singer or Johnny the church boy. Those versions didn't sell records or fill concert halls. Sam Phillips, the legendary producer who'd discovered both of them at Sun Studio, understood this tension intimately. He'd built his career and fortune on transforming Southern boys raised on gospel into rock and roll revolutionaries, on channeling their religious fervor into secular rebellion that white teenagers could finally embrace. Elvis's first hit for Sun had been That's All Right, a blues number that scandalized parents and thrilled kids. Johnny's breakthrough was I Walk the Line, about romantic fidelity, but sung with the intensity of religious conviction. Both songs had gospel DNA, the passion, the sincerity, the soul-deep commitment, but stripped of explicit Christianity because Jesus didn't sell to the mainstream market in 1956. The boys could have faith, but they had to hide it behind rebellion if they wanted success. This created a kind of spiritual schizophrenia that both Elvis and Johnny struggled with constantly. They'd perform rock and roll or country to screaming crowds, feeding on the adulation and energy, then retreat to hotel rooms and feel profound emptiness because the part of them that mattered most, their faith, was the part they couldn't share publicly. Elvis would sometimes spontaneously break into gospel songs backstage, needing that connection to something real, after hours of performing sexuality he didn't fully understand. Johnny would write hymns in his notebooks but never show them to anyone, convinced that his outlaw image and gospel music were fundamentally incompatible. Both men were famous beyond imagination, but profoundly lonely in ways that fame couldn't touch or heal. December 4th, 1956, started as a standard recording session. Carl Perkins was cutting some tracks, trying to follow up his massive hit, Blue Suede Shoes. Jerry Lee Lewis was playing piano for the session, filling in as part of the studio band. Elvis, who'd recently signed with RCA and was now the biggest star in music, dropped by Sun Studio to visit Sam Phillips and catch up with old friends. Johnny Cash, still signed to Sun and working on his second album, showed up for the same reason. It was supposed to be casual, just musicians hanging out between obligations. But when you put that much talent in one room, something was bound to happen. Sam Phillips, recognizing the historic potential, quietly asked his engineer Marian Kieska to keep the tape machines running, just in case. The session started playfully, almost like a party. Elvis sat at the piano, still wearing the sharp suit he'd worn to some promotional event earlier that day. Johnny leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching with that half-smile he wore when he was genuinely amused rather than performing amusement. Jerry Lee, already showing the manic energy that would make him famous, pounded out boogie-woogie rhythms. Carl picked at his guitar, adding flourishes and fills. They ran through rock and roll standards, trading vocals and laughing at inside jokes. This was professional, polished. These were hitmakers doing what they did best, and Marian's tapes captured it with crystal clarity. But then something shifted, subtle at first, but building into something none of them had planned. Someone, accounts vary on whether it was Elvis or Johnny, started singing a gospel song. Not performing it, just singing it the way you'd sing in church when the Spirit moved you, when worship was the point rather than entertainment. The song was Farther Along, an old hymn about suffering and faith and trusting God's plan even when life made no sense. Elvis's voice, so often used to sell rebellion and sexuality, became something completely different, vulnerable, sincere, seeking something beyond the microphone's reach. Johnny joined in on harmony, his deep voice grounding Elvis's soaring tenor, and suddenly they weren't Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash anymore. They were just two boys from Mississippi and Arkansas, singing the songs their mothers had taught them, reaching for the faith that fame had complicated but never destroyed. The rock and roll energy drained from the room, replaced by something quieter and infinitely more powerful. Jerry Lee, who would later build a career torn between gospel and devil's music, played piano with a reverence completely absent from his rock and roll performances. Carl's guitar became gentle, supportive, no longer showing off, but serving the song. And Elvis and Johnny kept singing, I won't have to cross Jordan alone, peace in the valley, just a closer walk with thee. These were songs they'd grown up with, songs that carried memories of wooden pews and summer revivals, and the certainty they'd felt as children that God was real and present and listening. For 90 minutes, they forgot about being stars and just became believers, and Marian Kieska's tape machines captured every second. What made it sacred, what transformed it from a professional recording into something holy, was that Elvis and Johnny genuinely believed the microphones were off. Sam Phillips had gestured to Marian to keep recording, but he'd done it subtly, not wanting to break the spell by making them self-conscious. Elvis and Johnny thought this was private, just musicians sharing their faith between obligations, so they sang differently than they ever sang in public. There was no showmanship, no performance, no awareness of audience. Elvis's voice cracked on certain high notes and he didn't care, didn't do another take, because this wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. Johnny sang harmony parts he'd never attempt in his own recordings, vulnerable and exposed in ways the man in black persona never allowed. They were singing for God, not for fame, and the difference was audible in every note. At one point, Elvis stopped between songs and said something that Marian's microphone barely captured, but that revealed everything about what this moment meant to him. Man, this is what it's supposed to feel like, he said, his voice quiet and almost wondering. All that other stuff, the screaming girls, the money, the movies they want me to make, it's fine, but this is why I learned to sing in the first place. To feel this. Johnny responded with something equally revealing. I know exactly what you mean. I go on stage and sing about walking the line and shooting people, and the whole time I'm thinking about the hymns we sang in church. This is home. Everything else is just noise. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes, too quiet for the tape to capture clearly, but Marian later described it as the most honest thing she'd ever heard from either of them. They sang every gospel song they could remember, pulling from deep childhood memories, teaching each other verses they'd forgotten or never learned. Elvis knew hymns Johnny didn't, and Johnny knew songs Elvis had never heard, and they filled in each other's gaps, like they'd been singing together for years instead of this being their first real musical collaboration. Jerry Lee contributed songs from his Pentecostal upbringing, his piano playing shifting from rock and roll showmanship to genuine worship. Carl added his own favorites from the Church of Christ tradition. It became a spontaneous church service, 4 men from different denominations and different circumstances, finding common ground in the gospel music that had shaped them all. And the beautiful part, the part that made this recording sacred rather than just interesting, was that they did it with zero awareness that posterity was listening. The engineer, Marian Kaiska, later described it as the most emotionally overwhelming experience of her career. She'd recorded hundreds of sessions at Sun Studio, had been there when Elvis cut That's All Right, and Jerry Lee recorded Great Balls of Fire. She'd witnessed the birth of rock and roll, had captured lightning in a bottle more times than she could count. But this gospel session was different. They weren't trying to make a record, she said in an interview decades later. They were trying to make peace with God, trying to reconnect with the faith that fame had complicated. I felt like I was eavesdropping on something private, something I had no right to hear. But Sam had asked me to keep recording, so I did. And I cried the entire time because what they were singing was so pure, so unguarded, so real. The tape ran for 93 minutes before Sam Phillips finally ended the session, not because the music had stopped, but because it was past midnight and the studio had other obligations the next morning. When Elvis and Johnny finally finished, there was a long silence, not awkward but full, the kind of quiet that follows genuine spiritual experience. Elvis stood up from the piano, and his face showed something Marian had never seen before. Peace. Not the manic energy of performance or the anxiety of fame, but actual peace, like he'd been carrying something heavy and had finally set it down. Johnny looked the same. His usual tension had dissolved, replaced by something softer and more vulnerable. They shook hands, then embraced, and Jerry Lee and Carl joined in, 4 men who competed in the marketplace but connected in faith, acknowledging that what they'd just shared mattered more than any chart position or record sale. "We should do this more often," Elvis said, and everyone nodded, but they all knew it wouldn't happen. The demands of fame, the expectations of their images, the relentless machinery of the music industry would pull them in different directions and keep them too busy for spontaneous worship. Sam Phillips walked them out to their cars, and only then did he mention that Marian had kept the tape machines running. The reaction was mixed. Elvis looked momentarily panicked. "You recorded that?" "That was private, Sam," but then resigned. Johnny just nodded, unsurprised, like he'd suspected all along that nothing in a recording studio was ever truly off the record. Jerry Lee shrugged, already moving on to whatever came next. But Sam promised them something that he'd mostly keep. "This tape is for the vault. It's not for release, not for sale. It's just for us to remember what we did here tonight." Elvis relaxed at that, and they said their goodbyes, each man returning to the public personas waiting outside the studio doors. What none of them knew was that the tape would become legendary, bootlegged and mythologized, eventually released officially as the $1 Million Quartet and studied by music historians as a crucial document of American popular music. The tape sat in Sun Studios' archives for years, exactly as Sam Phillips promised. It wasn't released commercially, wasn't shopped to record labels, remained a secret, known only to the handful of people who'd been in the studio that night. Elvis went on to become the king, starring in movies and selling millions of records and becoming so famous that his faith became a footnote to his sexuality. Johnny went through his addiction and recovery, his marriage to June Carter, his transformation into the man in black who sang in prisons and championed the forgotten. Jerry Lee became the wild man of rock and roll, torn between gospel and devil's music until the tension nearly destroyed him. Carl continued as a working musician, successful but never reaching the heights of his early promise. But all of them, for the rest of their lives, considered that December night at Sun Studio one of the most important musical experiences they'd ever had. Elvis, in particular, would reference it obliquely in interviews when asked about his faith. He couldn't talk about it directly without betraying Sam's promise to keep the tape private, but he'd say things like, "The best singing I ever did was in a Memphis studio with some friends, singing gospel like we did in church, not worrying about charts or hits or any of that. Just worrying about getting it right for God." Reporters usually missed the reference, assumed he was talking about some formal gospel recording session, but people who knew understood he was talking about the $1 Million Quartet session, the night the microphones were supposedly off. Johnny was more direct, less concerned with protecting the secret. In his autobiography, he wrote about it explicitly. One night in 1956, a few of us got together at Sun and sang gospel for hours. We thought we were just messing around, but it turned out to be the most honest music any of us ever made. No performance, no persona, no pretending. Just faith, pure and simple. I've sold millions of records, played for presidents, won every award you can win. But that night in Memphis, singing Peace in the Valley with Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis, that's the peak. That's when I was most fully myself. The tape itself became the subject of legend and litigation, bootlegged and traded among collectors, analyzed and mythologized beyond its actual content. RCA, which owned Elvis's contract, fought for years to suppress the tape, arguing that it violated Elvis's exclusive recording agreement. Sun Records countered that it was a casual session, not an official recording, and besides, Elvis had been singing gospel, not the rock and roll RCA wanted to protect. The legal battle was eventually settled out of court, with the tape officially released in 1981 as the $1 Million Quartet, though heavily edited to remove the between-song conversations that were deemed too private for public consumption. What the public heard was the music, extraordinary certainly, capturing four legends in rare collaboration. But what they didn't hear was the vulnerability, the honest discussion of faith and doubt, the moments when Elvis and Johnny stopped performing and just existed as believers. Those portions remained in the vault, considered too personal, too raw, too revealing of the humans beneath the mythologies. Elvis died in 1977, and at his funeral they played gospel music, not his rock and roll hits, but the hymns he'd grown up with, the songs he'd sung that night at Sun Studio. Johnny Cash was there, and he later said that hearing How Great Thou Art at Elvis's funeral brought him back to that December night in 1956, when they'd sung the same song thinking nobody was listening. He was at peace that night, Johnny said. More at peace than I ever saw him otherwise. Fame destroyed Elvis in a lot of ways, but that night, he wasn't famous. He was just a believer, and that version of Elvis, that's who I hope met God when he died. The sentiment was beautiful, but it also revealed the tragedy, that Elvis could only be fully himself when he thought nobody was watching, that authenticity required invisibility. The full unedited tape was finally released in 2006, 29 years after Elvis's death and 7 years before Johnny's. The additional material, the conversations, the false starts, the moments of genuine connection, transformed understanding of what had happened that night. Critics who dismissed the original $1 Million Quartet release as a novelty, a historical curiosity without much musical merit, reassessed completely. This wasn't just four musicians jamming. This was four men conducting a private worship service, using music to reconnect with faith that fame had complicated. The vulnerability was stunning, almost uncomfortable to witness, like reading someone's diary without permission. Elvis's voice when he talked about missing his mother, who'd recently died, and finding comfort in the hymns she'd taught him. Johnny admitting that he felt like a fraud singing about darkness and outlaws, when what he really wanted was to sing about light and redemption. Jerry Lee confessing his terror that God would punish him for playing devil's music. These weren't performances. These were confessions, intimate and raw and never intended for public consumption. The ethical questions around releasing this material were significant. Did the public's interest in hearing authentic Elvis and Johnny outweigh their right to privacy, even posthumously? Was this sacred music being commodified, turned into product when it had been created as worship? Music critics and ethicists debated these questions without reaching consensus. But the tape kept selling because people were desperate for authenticity from icons who'd been packaged and marketed beyond recognition. They wanted to hear the real Elvis, the real Johnny, the versions that existed when the cameras weren't rolling and the microphones were supposedly off. And what they heard was faith. Complicated, sincere, desperate faith from men who'd achieved everything the world could offer and still felt empty without God. The recording did something unexpected. It humanized legends who'd been mythologized into cartoons. Elvis wasn't just the hip-swiveling rebel or the bloated Vegas caricature. He was a mama's boy from Mississippi, who sang gospel to feel close to God and the mother he'd lost. Johnny wasn't just the man in black. He was an Arkansas preacher's kid who missed church and struggled to reconcile his outlaw image with his deep Christianity. The tape revealed that their public personas were constructions, necessary for fame, but fundamentally incomplete representations of who they actually were. The most powerful moment on the unedited tape comes near the end, when Elvis and Johnny are singing "Where Could I Go But to the Lord?" and Elvis's voice breaks completely on the line, "Where could I go but to the Lord?" He's not performing emotion, he's genuinely overcome, and there's a long pause where you can hear him composing himself. Johnny's voice continues alone, carrying the melody, giving Elvis space to recover. Then Elvis comes back in, and they finish the song together. And the intimacy of that moment, one artist supporting another through genuine emotional vulnerability, is almost unbearable to witness. This is what they couldn't do in public, what their images wouldn't allow. Genuine connection grounded in shared faith and mutual support. That moment alone justifies the tape's existence, proves that sometimes eavesdropping on privacy reveals truths that public performance can never access. In the decades since the tape's release, it's become a touchstone for discussions about faith and fame, about the cost of celebrity, about what we lose when we construct public personas that contradict our private truths. Musicians reference it constantly. Everyone from Bruce Springsteen to Bono to contemporary Christian artists cite it as evidence that authentic faith and commercial success can coexist, though usually uncomfortably. The tape has been analyzed in seminary courses about worship and performance, used as a case study in how consumer culture corrupts genuine religious experience. It's been sampled in hip-hop tracks, covered by gospel choirs, turned into a stage musical that tried and mostly failed to capture the magic of that spontaneous session. But beyond all the analysis and commentary and commercial exploitation, the tape remains what it always was. Four men singing for God when they thought nobody was listening, capturing a truth about faith that performance can never quite achieve. The ultimate irony is that the most authentic moment in Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash's careers happened when they believed they were off the record, when they'd set down the burden of being Elvis and Johnny and just became believers singing hymns. That distinction, between who they were for audiences and who they were for God, reveals something profound about the cost of fame. They could have everything the world offered, except the freedom to be fully themselves in public. So they stole moments in recording studios after hours, sang gospel when they thought the microphones were off, and found peace in the gap between public persona and private truth. The tape that captured one of those moments isn't just a historical document or a musical curiosity. It's evidence that beneath the mythology, beneath the images carefully constructed to sell records, there were actual human beings with souls and doubts and faith that fame could never quite extinguish. When Johnny Cash died in 2003, his funeral featured gospel music just like Elvis's had. And among the hymns performed was Farther Along, the same song that had kicked off that spontaneous worship session 47 years earlier at Sun Studio. The people who knew the story understood the reference, recognized that Johnny's life had been defined by the tension between fame and faith, between the man in black persona and the believer beneath it. He'd spent decades walking the line between those identities, never quite reconciling them, but never abandoning either. That December night in 1956, for 93 minutes, he hadn't needed to reconcile anything. He'd just been a believer singing for God, and that had been enough. The tape that captured it remains in the vaults at Sun Studio, the original reel preserved as a cultural artifact, a reminder of a moment when four legends forgot about being legendary and just became human. Every year, musicians make pilgrimages to Sun Studio, hoping to capture some of that magic, hoping to access the same authenticity that Elvis and Johnny found when they thought nobody was listening. Most of them fail because authenticity can't be performed or manufactured. It can only be accidentally captured when people forget to guard themselves. That's the final lesson of the Dollar Quartet gospel session. The truest art happens when we stop trying to make art and just try to connect with whatever we believe is larger than ourselves, whether that's God or love or truth or beauty. Elvis and Johnny connected with God that night, and Marian Kaiska's tape machines preserved it. And decades later, we can still hear the sound of two men being fully, vulnerably, authentically themselves, which turns out to be the rarest and most valuable recording of all.